All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Karen Brown. I am the director of the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change and also co-leading a University of Minnesota-wide initiative on the Sustainable Development Goals with Katie Pelican, who will meet in a moment. I welcome all of you to our webinar entitled Feeding Inequities, Food Justice in Minnesota Communities. This is the second in a series of webinars we've organized on the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're really delighted to have all of you here with us. I will be introducing our wonderful panel of 4 speakers in a few minutes before their remarks. But before we do that, there's a couple of housekeeping items with respect to the webinar that I want to mention. Next slide, please. So please note that we are recording the webinar. It will be recorded and it will later be available at the website indicated here on the slide. If you're having trouble with Zoom, we provided a link for you to go to for help. And finally, note that this is a webinar format. So your audio and video as participants will be off during the webinar, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions written to the presenters in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring that Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can after we hear from our presenters. Next, please. Now I'm going to turn over to, one more thing I'll mention is we do have a couple additional webinars coming up, one on August 25th on the SDG on inequality and diversity, and one on September 24th focused on questions of housing, which relates to sustainable cities and communities. Now I'm going to turn over to Katie Pelican to say a little something about the SDG initiative before we invite our speakers. Go ahead. Katie?
Thank you, Karen. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing. Karen and I are co-leading this initiative that cuts across the whole university. We are supported by the GPS Alliance, Global Program and Strategy Alliance. So we thank them for their support, but we also have many advisors from around the university community. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, these were developed by a very large interdisciplinary advisory group through the United Nations. There are 17 of these goals, and they really represent a framework or a blueprint to move both human and environmental issues forward in a sustainable way. It's really a combination of what used to be the Millennium Development Goals and the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment into one sustainable framework. So there are 17 of them. They were initiated in 2015, and they are to create this for 30 years. That is a 30-year effort. Next slide, please. So we as an institution and as this initiative belong to a number of communities that are working and compacts and agreements that are working towards helping with the Sustainable Development Goals, and this initiative is building on those. So that includes belonging to the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We also, our president signed the University Global Compact, which is an agreement among universities to support the Sustainable Development Goals. And most recently, we are looking to contribute to the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings as an institution. Next. So the goals of this initiative are to support interdisciplinary work towards helping to achieve the goals as an institution, to really bring in and foster new funding, new programs to address the Sustainable Development Goals, and then to really develop a portfolio of evidence-based work towards impact. So we are more of a facilitative initiative. We are really looking to build on existing work that's happening here at the university rather than necessarily starting anything new. So efforts like this are to, this webinar and some other things I'll talk about later are really to help the community focus maybe and use the framework to help have more impact. Next slide. So our current activities include Next. This really to document, we're doing quite a bit of sort of metric work and developing or meeting some reporting requirements that we are hoping to achieve. That includes the SDG Accord has some reporting requirements, and then also helping the university get together for the Times ranking. Next. We are also through events like this, but also some other work, trying to get teams together. We're working with centers, we're working with existing interdisciplinary teams to help support them in having more impact and aligning to the goals. And then next. And finally, we are doing things like this webinar series. We're also hosting a series of collisions, which collisions are really about getting teams together towards potential funding sources or around crises or issues in the community around different sustainable development goals. So please stay tuned to hear more about those. Next. So, you know, I think an example of some of the work we're doing actually comes from Sustainable Cities and Communities. We've been fostering a group that's focused on housing from across the university, really looking at it holistically. We're doing something similar with food security, where we're getting different centers that are involved in food security to support communities that are in crisis right now around food. And so, you know, how do we take a more systems-based approach at some of these challenges in society? And we're really looking to foster some of that. And with that, I'll turn it back to our excellent panelists today.
Great, thanks, Katie. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists before they give their remarks, and we will hold your questions until all four panelists have had a chance to speak. We really are fortunate to have an incredible group of people here today who are doing a variety of kinds of work to support food justice at the university and beyond the university. So I'm really delighted to have them with us, and I think we're going to learn a lot from their work today. We're going to start with Jamie Bain. Jamie is a University of Minnesota Associate Extension Professor of Family Development and Health and Nutrition Extension Educator in the Twin Cities Metro region. She also serves as coordinator of the Metro Food Justice Network, which is working to create a reimagined Metro Food Justice Network building off the work of Metro Food Access Network, Minnesota Social Gastronomy Movement, Minnesota Food Charter Network, and a robust community engagement process. Jamie is a natural weaver, connector, and collaborator working on food justice. She believes that through authenticity, imagination, playfulness, and deep connectivity, we can find the solution to life's wicked problems together. She also listens and feels for common ground with communities and organizations who want to co-create a food system meant to nourish everyone. She has an undergraduate degree in nutrition, a master's degree in public health, and she is a lifelong learner in the areas of joy and love. We're really looking forward to hearing a little about your work today, Jamie, and now I'll turn over to you for some remarks.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. I'm used to the non-webinar version of Zoom, so it's a little weird not to be able to see people's faces, but I'm going to imagine that you're all in your living rooms listening. As Karen said, I work for the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm honored to be here. All of my work is focused on food justice, and so this is a relevant webinar for me for sure. I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about my uniqueness and why I'm passionate about food justice. So I identify as a heterosexual, cisgendered white woman. I grew up in a middle-class suburb of the Twin Cities, surrounded by very upper-class white people. My family has generational wealth from land stolen from Native Americans, and I am still extremely passionate about this work and have been passionate about this work for a long time now. And I think, I say that because I think as white people, we need to own our part in dismantling these systems of oppression, like our food system, and owning that we are part of the creation of the process. And with our power and privilege, we need to use that front and center in our work. So I just wanted to start with that. So my work is all focused on anti-racism and the values that I see associated with anti-racism. So that's authenticity and trust and collaboration and cooperation, and really about shared leadership and decentralizing power. And the way that I do that is through a number of different programs. First and foremost, I've been the coordinator of the Metro Food Justice Network, which was formerly the Metro Food Access Network, for the last 7 years. And it's pretty interesting to be the coordinator of a network because it's not the sexiest thing alive. We are trying to get funding for building relationships and building connectivity, because we believe that connectivity is the foundation for moving towards alignment and collective action. And not only have we been able to reduce silos through that work by creating those authentic, trusting relationships, but we have been able to move to collective action as well, just with our primary focus always being on relationships. That collective action emerged because relationships, when they're founded on authenticity and trust, tend to move in that direction. And so some things that we've been able to do are completely redesign food shelves across Minnesota in this program called Super Shelf, where we provide a more dignified experience for people, where they actually get to have more of a grocery shopping experience rather than the more stigmatizing typical food shelf experience. We've transformed 50% of comprehensive plans at the city and county level to include food for the first time. So that means that none of the zoning or regulations that went into city and county planning ever included food until 2018. So hopefully that will make big shifts moving forward in the Twin Cities Metro. And then we've also started really working on anti-racism. We hosted a series called Critical Conversations on Race in the Food System that was attended by about 150 of our partners. And we dug deep into white supremacy culture and our role in dismantling the oppressive system of food. And as a result of that, we've seen organizations hiring a far more diverse pool of candidates. We've seen their programs shift very much to be more explicitly anti-racist. And so we're really proud of all of that work, and really just trusting that relationships at their core can shift this work. A few other things that I've done with those same values that I was talking about are participatory grant making and facilitation. You wouldn't necessarily put those two things together for food justice, but I tend to work at the very sort of policy and systems level, and so it's all connected for me. The participatory grant making, the reason we got into doing that is because we heard from our Black, Indigenous, and people of color partners that they have the skills, they have the knowledge, they have all of the internal resources that they need, but they don't have the funding. And it's really hard to get funding from the traditional sources because they tend to fund well-resourced organizations and familiar organizations. There's over $8 billion available for foundations to grant out to organizations. And of that, most of them don't provide more than the 5% that they're obligated to communities. And of that 5%, only 7.5% are granted to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so we were able to take some of our funding from within our SNAP Ed program and then from a couple of other sources to do some imaginative participatory grant making and completely flip philanthropy on its head and get funding into the hands of Black, Indigenous, and people of color working on food justice issues. First they were able to apply using a written proposal, a lyrical poem, or a video, however they wanted to apply. And then they decided who got funding and for how much. We completely took ourselves out of the decision-making equation and allowed them to make all the decisions. And then from there, we didn't ask them to do any reporting, but we did bring them together on a quarterly basis to share what they've learned and to ask questions of each other. So we're creating this network of people that wouldn't have otherwise known each other, and they have this investment with each other because they've actually funded each other. And they're helping each other do these amazing food justice projects across the state. So I'm really passionate now that I've learned more about the whole philanthropy field, about really trying to shift that field on its head because they hold so much power and it's just done in such a stereotypical white supremacist way. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is facilitation. I love facilitating. I love the creativity behind it. I love getting to work with other people. And I also see it as sort of this elitist skill that people have and they hold and they pay thousands of dollars to be trained in. And it's really a way to decentralize power, to have all of the voices in the room have an equalness, no matter who's in the space. It's a way of creating innovation and creativity. And so I don't think that it's something that should be held in the hands of few. And so I try to help anyone working in the food world to understand how to have more engaging and meaningful meetings through quality facilitation. So those are the ways that I come at food justice. I understand that our food system wasn't ever created to feed everyone. It was created to help white people thrive and to help Black, Indigenous, and people of color be oppressed. It started with stripping the land from Native Americans, and then we enslaved Black people to grow our food, and now we have Black and brown people helping to grow our fields or grow our food using chemicals that most other countries wouldn't allow and don't allow our food with those chemicals to be distributed to. We have literally every aspect of the food system. People working in each and every sector are paid, they're not paid a living wage. And so there's nothing about our food system that's set up to help people thrive. And so I see that as my responsibility to use my power and privilege to help dismantle using the strengths that I have. And so that's why I do what I do. And I can't wait to hear about what all the other panelists are up to and have an engaging conversation about how we can do it better together.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jamie. Now we're going to move to Julie Grossman. Julie is an associate professor in biological and sustainable horticulture in the Department of Horticultural Science here at the University of Minnesota. She has an MS in soil science and a PhD in agronomy and plant genetics from the University of Minnesota and was an NSF postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University. Julie's research explores the way to better manage plant-soil microbe relationships to enhance soil fertility through microbial processes, with an ultimate goal of developing sustainable food production systems. She has a strong interest in community-engaged research and sustainable agriculture education, collaborating with immigrant and minority farmers in her research program. At the University of Minnesota, she teaches the community-based capstone course for the undergraduate food systems major, as well as a course focusing on farm and soil management using Student Organic Farm as a living laboratory. She's an affiliated faculty member of the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change and a fellow with the Institute on the Environment. And I also look forward to hearing about Julie's work today, and I'll turn it over to you now, Julie.
Great, thanks Karen, and thanks Katie and Karen for inviting me here today. I wish this webinar could go on for about 3 hours because after Jamie's comments, I want to just sit and talk to her more. So we'll have to do that offline, Jamie. I especially love the idea of the participatory grant making. I think that's ultimately where we need to go, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more in our Q&A today. So I want to start out just with some images of things you may have seen in the press back in April and May. Number one, of vegetables being dumped in piles destined for not to people's homes, but just to rot. And that was, of course, driven largely by this pandemic that we're in now, where we were unable, and still are in many cases, to get the food from where it was grown to the supermarkets, usually a great distance away, to where it was being sold. So these transportation issues force farmers to let these crops rot in the field. At the same time, of course, we have this irony of the farm workers that are picking the crops. So the labor on the farm depends on the farm workers, many of whom are undocumented, and they were deemed essential. So they were put at risk in the field, at home, due to inadequate housing and unable to access medical care, again, driven by the pandemic. So then we have, next slide, please. The images like this, where we saw an unprecedented demand and surge to people to our food banks and our food shelves where food was being distributed. And the lack of being able to move the food from the field to the food bank, or even if the food did make it to the food bank, the inability of the staff to be able to process that amount of food in the current conditions led to a lot of situations of people being unable to access food they needed and relied upon in the face of losing their job or losing their housing. So we have these features that are really showing us, really making it clear that this pandemic has shown a light on our broken food system. And this is a crisis that was in place long before COVID-19. And of course, all of this is in a context that is housed within entrenched racism and inequality, and that determines who does and doesn't face food insecurity. So it's all connected. Next slide, please. Here in Minnesota, we have some alternative food movements like everywhere else that are also heavily impacted by what we're seeing with the pandemic. This is Shared Ground. Shared Ground is an immigrant farmer organization, mostly owned and managed by Latinx farmers who own and manage their farms, and they largely sell to restaurants, and they have a thriving CSA to which they sell hundreds of boxes of food each year. They've been around since about 2014, and the goal of the organization is to both increase market access to Latinx producers, but also to ensure a living wage to farmers. So that is a core piece of what they're trying to do. Next slide, please. My research program at the University of Minnesota has worked with Shared Ground for a number of years in more of a research capacity, where we work alongside farmers to try to answer questions they want answered. So again, as Karen said earlier, we do work related to plant-soil interactions, specifically in organic systems or in systems where people might not have access to inputs, so they are using organic approaches. But by working with these farmers, it allowed us to really deepen relationships with these farmers and allow us to take on risk by coming up with maybe some crazy ideas that they wanted to test in the field, and us doing that research where they didn't have to use some of their farmland to do things that may or may not work. So this has really been a rich relationship for us. We've worked very closely with this farmer in particular, Rodrigo Cala. And the woman you see in the picture is Vivian Waters, who just finished her PhD here at the University of Minnesota. And she worked with Rodrigo through all of her PhD program, and ultimately ended up with a beautiful dissertation where she had chapters that were written about the biophysical aspects of what we do, but also a wonderful chapter on building relationships with farmers and some of the challenges and successes that can result from those relationships. Next slide, please. So what I want to spend a little bit more time on is a case study of what we did this past spring, where we had started working with Shared Ground in my teaching program as well. So this is something relatively new. We developed this collaborative teaching relationship with Shared Ground farmers in the past 2 years or so. And this was done through a capstone class that I teach as part of our food systems major we have here at the University of Minnesota. That is for senior level undergrads. So we have about 20 students in the class every year, and each student is assigned or matched with an organization that has developed a proposal with us to get a question or get some work done in their organization that will advance their goals as an organization. So one of those is Shared Ground. My goals for my students in the class include things like getting them to think about how to effectively collaborate with farmers, how to build those relationships, how to be a change maker, and a little bit about how to work alongside or with those that have different perspectives or come from different backgrounds that the students in my class do. So through that, I hope to develop the cultural competency skills in my students so that they can go out and be the Jamie Baines of tomorrow. And all these things that Jamie was talking about, they require skills that sometimes people naturally have them, sometimes they don't, but they require practice, and they require a safe environment in which to do that and learn how to effectively work alongside those that are trying to make effective change in the food system. So pre-COVID-19, we had 3 students that were working with Shared Ground. They were Mar Horns, Oriel Pillion, and Leslie Blanco, and they were all senior food systems majors. And before the pandemic hit, they would help plan CSA shares, they would allocate produce orders to farmers, tell them how much was needed and where they need to bring it, and they reviewed bids for public school, farm to school programs. So fairly standard stuff. When COVID-19 hit, the majority of the restaurants, of course, that Shared Ground was selling to lost their market. They lost those markets, and because the restaurants obviously closed. And then the students we had to figure out what to do. And Shared Ground, because they lost those markets, they were forced to lay off their permanent staff, and the students are what they had left to work with. So the students, in effect, were almost brought up to a staff level within Shared Ground, for better or for worse. We could talk a little bit about what that meant during the Q&A, but the result for Shared Ground was that the students were able to do research on safety practices related to food handling for the farmers, translate that material into Spanish, and serve as a resource for the farmers and for Shared Ground as an organization to really create a safe environment that they could, through which they could develop the CSA shares and a market for those CSA shares and gather members. So this was hugely successful. Shared Ground, like many CSAs and farmer organizations in the Twin Cities, sold out shares this year. People are looking for alternatives to buy food directly from growers, support the growers, and also not have to go to grocery stores. So that was a success in many ways, and good for the students, as well as hopefully good for Shared Ground as well. Next slide, please. The final slide I have is more of a question for everybody, where and hopefully we can talk about this in the Q&A, is it's referring to what Jamie mentioned about using our privilege and our power to bring about these changes that we want to see. Because I would really argue that we in the Academy have so much power and so much privilege and a lot of opportunities to advance these organizations that are working to make change in the Twin Cities area and beyond. So do we have power to bring about change in our food systems? I say we do. There are a lot of challenges and problems in implementation and how to make that happen. But hopefully we can come back to that a little bit later, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Julie. I want to remind participants that you can put questions into the Q&A at any time. We'll take them all at the end, but you're welcome to start putting questions in if you have them for our speakers. Our third speaker, I am glad to welcome Reginaldo Hazlet Marroquin. Reginaldo began working on economic development projects with indigenous Guatemalan communities in 1988. He served as a consultant for the United Nations Development Program's Bureau for Latin America, advisor to the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, and was a founding member of the Fair Trade Federation in 1994. After coming to the US in 1992, he founded and directed the Fair Trade Program for the Institute of Agriculture and Trade Policy and founded Minneapolis-based Peace Coffee. He received his agronomy degree from the Central National School of Agriculture, studied at the University of San Carlos in Guatemala, and graduated from Augsburg University in Minneapolis. Rehi has received numerous awards for his work, including Twin Cities International Citizens of the Year in 1996 and the Lifetime Ashoka Fellowship in 2018 for his work in regenerative poultry systems. Most recently, he authored In the Shadow of Green Man, My Journey from Poverty and Hunger to Food Security and Hope. He is now owner and founder of Regeneration Farms and founder and president of the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance, which I believe he will tell us a bit about today. Welcome, Reginaldo. I'll turn the panel over to you now.
Thank you. Very much appreciate Karen and everybody in the panel. Thanks for this opportunity to share a little bit of what we do here. It's critical to understand that I'm by no means coming to give you the recipe to the solutions to everything. I am simply going to give you a little bit of the wisdom we have accumulated over time on the basis of our indigenous upbringing and how we approach these very issues we are talking about. So first of all, I work on a methodology that was developed over centuries and that was perfected towards the end of the Civil War in Guatemala by the indigenous communities in the highlands. And it is a very opposite system to what we normally use to work here in the United States, but achieves, is based on achieving specific outcomes, specifically decolonization by methodology and by design, rather than by argumentation. By that I mean restructuring the systems that dominate and from the ground up. The second big part is the indigenization, as we can't really decolonize what we're doing if we can't see ourselves and see nature and the world and our relationships from our foundational principles that we are indigenous to the earth. All of us can be indigenous, all of us. That is a misunderstood concept. We are indigenous because of the way we live, not because of where we are from. We are native to certain territories. So like Native Americans, like the Sioux, like the Maya and so on. But indigenous we can all be, and that's what we strive for. And that's the concept of the foundational decolonizing work that we do at the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance. So in seeking these solutions, the first thing we have to recognize is that we need to decolonize everything, our minds and how we approach everything, including how we approach food justice. Basically, the lack of access to nutritious, abundant, and affordable food, which is what's described in the principle 2, is only achievable by redesigning and decolonizing the current supply chain. It can't, the current system is not designed to do that. As designed today, this system is structured to extract value from nature, from workers and consumers, while delivering fill, non-nutritional food, at the highest possible price, while capturing every possible subsidy. Subsidies justified by the continuous increase in hunger and lack of access to the very food the system has deliberately and systemically made less accessible, more distance, less nutrition in the first place. So we have to understand that dichotomy. If we don't understand that, then food justice, may take very different forms, except it won't be solved. Critical to understand how we approach this is understanding the culture of colonization, which is what results in unjust systems. And I don't mean just food. It's unjust systems. It's inequity in almost every aspect of our lives. Is the result of that colonizing mentality that we apply to everything we do. So the key indicators of colonization, but also the pivots for decolonizing. The first thing is the acceptance and perpetuation of extractive and exploitative science and practices in the food system. So almost every chemistry class I took in ag school was designed to extract something. It was never designed to manage energy and existing systems the way they were designed. Now, reverting that is critical. It's a pivoting point. Community food infrastructure and sovereignty is compromised and destroyed. That's a critical indicator of whether a system is colonized or is designed or it has opportunities to become more just. The legitimization and legalization of violence against ideas and innovations counter to the system, such as ancestral traditions and knowledge, culture, food sovereignty concepts, and all of that, that is a critical indicator that not only are we dealing with a core colonization structure, but also it's a pivot from where we can start reversing that. The legalization and abuse of government-sponsored corporate takeovers and market manipulation, that's really what generates the lack of access that we have today and the hunger and malnutrition. Concentration of ownership and control of the whole supply chain and production systems is absolutely counter to us solving food access. The systematization of repression and invalidation of indigenous knowledge and the decolonization methodology, such as the one that developed by indigenous communities around the world, native communities, the wisdom and science on which a just food system can be built, that has been invalidated. And unfortunately, some of our own academic institutions are responsible for some of that. So there is a pivoting point there for us to become better educational institutions as well. And then food insecurity the unjust corporate control food system, the climate disruption, war, conflict, and social breakdown. Those are critical outcomes of colonizing the way we approach food. So achieving the SDG number 2 cannot be reduced to ideas for how people can access the current supply chain. Access now is a critical emergency measure and a crisis management and survival strategy, but it is not how food justice is achieved. We must be clear about that. So finally, at the REA, our key operating priority is to build an intellectual insurgency as a foundation of restructuring the food supply chain and regenerating and indigenizing the science, the engineering, and the methodology as a foundation of food production systems. And by that, I mean, farmers stop being producers and start being stewards of energy transformation from non-edible into edible. Consumers stop being consumers and start being stewards of the physical, spiritual, and mental health as they put food in their bodies. Those are fundamental methods for decolonizing our mind and then decolonizing the supply. The key outcomes can be summarized into this key operating criteria. Urban communities organize and partner with rural farming communities to build appropriate infrastructure and a resilient, accountable, community-controlled supply chain that can deliver abundant, affordable, nutritious food. This is completely possible. Over 1,500 communities have achieved a tremendous level of this self-sufficiency and sovereignty in places where these ancient methodologies have been applied. And by the way, what Jamie was talking about it speaks straight to that methodology. We just happen to have some of those original texts that were developed by the communities in Guatemala during the war. Farming communities organizing and partnering with urban communities to reduce distance, include food cost of the food cost accounting, collective design and facilities access. They increase in the integrity and the value of the nutrition of the food that reaches everyone. At the end of the day, we don't buy food, we buy nutrition. And from the perspective of buying nutrition, there is a whole different way of accounting for the cost of that and the cost of the current so-called cheap food. So collectively organizing economic structures, of course, is central because right now, a lot of the wealth that is transferred from inner city communities to the rural communities is actually extracted by the middle infrastructure that is there and specifically designed to extract, not to feed, not to make food more accessible. Farmers and consumers affected by the current system must redefine our roles and responsibilities and move from being victims of an unjust system to becoming intellectual insurgents and really taking on the redefinition, the decolonization of the process of farming, the ownership of the supply chain, and especially food access infrastructure. So to this end, we have now fully engineered and started the deployment and scaling up of a regenerative poultry system centered on 14 enterprise sectors that integrated can generate those urban-rural connections, as well as allow us to redeploy infrastructure and a new economic model and organizational and governing system at a larger scale. We recently purchased a meat processing facility in the border with Iowa, and that will be turned over and made completely owner control by the workers, those workers that just recently were exploited and decimated by the conventional meat packers. So this is how we are attempting to approach this whole issue by focusing on ownership and control, governance, and partnerships.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rahid. And now we will turn it over to our last panelist, Lisa Wong. Lisa has been with the University of Minnesota Extension's Center for Family Development since 2015. She coordinates the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, education in the Twin Cities metro area. She and her team collaborate with community partners on a range of public health projects and foster relationships with Black, Indigenous, and community members of color through culturally responsive health and nutrition education. Her work includes food justice through community collaboration with a focus on health and nutrition in the Twin Cities area. Lisa served in the Peace Corps Ethiopia as a community health specialist with a focus on reproductive health, food security, and gender equality. Lisa holds a master's in public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and will complete her master's in public health this summer. Her perspective of a child of immigrants growing up in an industrial agricultural community in California has rooted her work in health equity and more just food systems. Lisa, I look forward to hearing your remarks. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you for allowing me the space to share my thoughts and perspectives on food justice here in Minnesota and the work of our health and nutrition programs and extensions Center for Family Development. I'm really honored to be on this panel with everyone today. Clearly everyone has incredible passion and has done incredible work in community. I don't think I can start the conversation of food justice without acknowledging that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities sits on Dakota land that was ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. As we know, land is a food justice issue so pertinent to the topic today. We also can't discuss food justice without acknowledging racial injustices and economic justice. And it's imperative we acknowledge that people and community are at the center of food justice. We're in a really historic time, as we all can feel that and see that in our country's racial conscious following the murder of George Floyd. And that has had incredible implications on our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color statewide and also around the world. The Metro, particularly in South Minneapolis and North Minneapolis, the Midway and Frogtown Rondo areas of St. Paul have lost several grocery stores and community gardens. These areas are already experience high rates of food insecurity. So since COVID-19, it obviously has compounded those existing issues of racial and economic injustices and really highlight the flaws in the systems that dictate food access. We see many of our essential workers, oftentimes communities of colors and Indigenous folks on the front line. For example, we've seen cases of COVID-19 outbreaks in many of our meat processing facilities where many immigrant communities such as Latinx, Somali, and Karen communities work in. And these issues then again can be compounded based on available resources in urban and rural areas. So some of our staff, we are a statewide program, have relationships with communities in rural areas as well. And these existing relationships through existing classes, such as some of the diabetes prevention courses that have been culturally responsive, those relationships have been vital during these crises. In the health and nutrition program, our work has traditionally been centered around nutrition education for communities living with limited incomes. So over time, we've begun to focus on shifting the various systems and environments that inhibit communities' access to nutritious and culturally relevant foods. And during this time, we are responding to emergency needs of our communities at the moment, and our organization's response is both internal and external. I'll first briefly discuss some of the work our team on the ground are doing in the community, many of which are our staff, our communities in which they grew up and live in. Many of our staff are embedded and have deep relationships in their communities that have made a difference in how we do our work. And I wanted to acknowledge that, you know, one of our staff, April Smith, who's a SNAP-Ed educator, works with her community, the American Indian community in Minneapolis. She's helped to organize some pop-up food shelves at the Powwow Grounds Cafe, and she is in the midst of organizing a food access coalition to address food insecurity in the encampments we are seeing in the metro area. Already, they have been able to source food from institutions to produce meals at the encampments. And we have staff operating pop-up food shelves in North Minneapolis and redirecting overflow of certain food items to other areas. And that's through collaboration with Black community leaders and organizations. Our staff has been redirecting a lot of these donations and just trying to manage the supply chain for these food shelves. We're also partnering with our extension program, Master Gardener program, to source food from volunteer gardens to redirect to the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority and different housing sites that have low access to food and food resources. And that's also a partnership with the Good Acre, who will be sourcing food from Black, Indigenous, people of color farmers. And so our growing relationships and communities have allowed our organization to be conduits to existing resources, which is a primary function of Extension's work. For our team not in the field, we've had monthly calls to over the 300 food shelves in our state to update information on new hours, change in operations, from client choice to a drive-through model, understanding the changes and demands and needs of the food shelf. This has helped us to update our partners at Hunger Solutions, who has a food support website and runs the food helpline in the state. It also helps to inform the governor's food security task force to make responsive policy decisions to the growing need. And recently, WALS provided $12 million toward hunger relief in the state after visiting the Department of Indian Works in St. Paul, where they have a food shelf there. And that was in collaboration with Super Shelf, which Jamie had alluded to earlier. Additionally, we are providing technical assistance to community partners for grants provided through the CARES Act. And we're starting to see a fizzle of donations in the community, but the needs remain high. Many of the grocery stores are not up and running. And especially we see a big gap in culturally relevant foods for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And this makes me really concerned as we enter a new phase of food injustices and food insecurity in our communities, and in which the economic ability to pay for food may be diminished should support of the CARES Act dissipate, especially the $600 for those who have lost their jobs. Concurrently, I also see that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have led their community in building a foundation for food justice. For example, you see Dream of Wild Health expanding their farm in the midst of COVID-19. So there are lots of examples of where community, BIPOC community especially, is really able to come to the forefront and reimagine the food system. So as an organization, we will need to continue to respond to emergency needs that our community is asking for. In the long run, as an institution, we need to address anti-racist structures to work toward food justice and become more culturally attuned. We will continue to do our work with collaboration, authentic relationships, and acknowledging traditional foodways, and let the community own and lead us in the new future where food justice can be achieved and food systems can be reimagined.
Thank you very much. Wow, what an incredible set of remarks. And in this moment where we have the dual crises of the COVID-19 pandemic and systemic racism and the movement to eradicate it, it's just really incredible to hear all the work that you're all doing on food justice. It's very inspiring. We do have a few questions from our participants that I will pose to you, and we have about 10 minutes left for a few questions. I want to start by just answering one of the questions that was posed, which was, will this be accessible after the event? And yes, we will make the recording available to you after the event. So the first question I think is an important one because I think you've talked a little bit about different parts of the food system. And one of our attendees wants to know about what are the differences and similarities in food insecurity issues between rural and urban areas in Minnesota or elsewhere, and how much does commercial agriculture affect these issues of food insecurity in Minnesota? So if anyone wants to jump in and take respond to that question, that would be great.
I could go and just quickly address some fundamental misunderstandings of farm country. Farm country is probably the most food deprived in the whole ecosystem. If you're a farmer, conventional farmer, which is most of the farmers in the Midwest, Minnesota alone has 25 million acres, 26 million, I believe, acres of farmland that is plowed, tilled, and cultivated every year. And yet, none of those farmers wakes up, harvests their food, and eats breakfast from their gardens, from their farm. All of them are dependent on cheap foods, nutritionally compromised systems that they have to go and purchase just like everybody else, but different from people in the city. The farmer doesn't live, a block from the shop, from the store, or even a mile from the store. In some places we're working, like in Pine Ridge Reservation, the closest grocery store is 90 miles away. You can't walk, you can't even bike, you can't motorcycle there on most days. So just to give you a little bit of a context on how dire some of the farmers who are not growing food, but rather are just farming. And that is very different. Don't misunderstand farming from food production. Those are two different things. And so just to put a little bit of context there and to give you a beginning point where you can actually extrapolate and imagine what life looks like when the food supply chain is disrupted and this community's food supply is disrupted is scary. So I'll leave it at that.
And I think this is a great time to highlight some of the great work that's being done by the University of Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships and the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, also at the university with a coalition of community organizations doing work to try to change that, to increase the degree to which rural grocery stores exist and feed people in that region, and also the degree to which people in the communities that are producing food crops can sell successfully to those grocery stores and have those grocery stores market local foods, because most of the rural grocery stores that exist don't have the infrastructure set up to understand how to purchase local foods and make that an option, even if people wanted it in rural places. So that's something that we should hold up and support in all ways possible.
The only other thing I'd add is that I would love to have a conversation about the ways that we are more similar than we are different from metro to rural. We tend to focus on a scarcity model and what the differences are, and to hammer in on that. And I believe that we go where we talk about and what we believe. And so if we could talk more about what the similarities are and what the strengths are between those two systems more often, we would be able to harness that energy moving forward.
Great, thank you. Another question that's been posed is about the makeup of the farming community in Minnesota. So one of our participants wonders what share of farmers and farm landowners are people of color in Minnesota and in the US more broadly. And I don't know if anybody has those.
I actually have them right here because the student I highlighted in my talk actually had that slide in her presentation. So I think if I can just take a second, I can highlight those statistics. Tell me if you can see my screen. Can you guys see that? Okay, so those are the numbers. See if I can make them bigger. This is Minnesota. So as you can see, it's what, 98% white. And I thought she had, yeah, there we go, 651 Hispanic Latino. And this is from 2017, so it's a few years old. But anybody who's out on the panel, other panelists, does this look accurate for what you've heard as well?
Yeah.
Yes, with the difference that the assistant commissioner, Patrice, Bailey. They led this new conversation about emerging farmers, and they did some similar, localized. Not this is not from the USDA and ASS, but they found out very similar trends all across the state. These were actually meetings that some of us attended, and so on. The NASS, I used that in the past to assess the amount of farm operators that were Latino. And we did an outreach to all of those that registered themselves as Hispanic or Latino. And we also found that a lot of people had reported to be Latino or Hispanic without being. So, but it seems like it's more than what the NASS is reporting. So, but not by much. We were looking at 950 versus 651. So overall, I think the statistic is correctly in portraying the photo of what Minnesota looks like when it comes down to participation of POC.
Great. And it is growing. I think that's worth saying here. This is national. So just to flip those up there really quickly.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having that right at your fingertips.
Yeah, it was, I saw that question come up. I was like, oh, that was a week ago. I saw it, so it was perfect.
You could unshare your screen now. That would be great. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. We only have a few minutes left, and we have a couple of questions relating to the effect of government policies and agencies. So I'm going to kind of clump those together and throw them out to you panelists. One is for indigenous farming communities, how is development affected by federal and state policies and regulations? So wondering about preserving traditional agricultural methods while going through the bureaucratic processes and regulations. And then kind of a related question is, what is the level of collaboration between the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Department of Health to address these issues of food scarcity? So one's about sort of federal and state policies with regard to indigenous food producers, and the other is about are we finding a collaboration across these departments of government? So if folks have thoughts on those, please jump in.
Quickly, this is Ray again. More recently, the cooperation between departments has been a lot stronger. I think Governor Tim Walz has done a tremendous job in bringing more of that to the Department of Agriculture. DEED in agriculture, for example, was just visiting us in the region, looking at the regional development. Has never happened before, and so on. In terms of tradition and bureaucracy and the spirituality and all of that associated with indigenous approaches, let me just close by saying that, you know, for us who see food as not as something that you go and buy at the store, but something that is so intrinsic to our mental, physical, and emotional, spiritual health. Food and eating is really a primal and fundamental act of spirituality. And that's fundamental, and no bureaucracy, no government program, no corporation is ever going to change that for those of us who are legitimately pursuing that way of living. So now, on the other hand, that way of living is not up for sale either. And so when it comes down to what we are growing for the market, that would merge and dovetail with a lot of the colonizing system, and to the extent that we can, we will decolonize.
Great, thank you. I want to ask if Jamie, Lisa, or Julie, if you have any last comments before we close out the webinar in response to those questions.
I don't have anything further that Rehi didn't discuss. I think that was a perfect way to end it, Rehi.
Agree.
Great.
Agreed.
Well, it is 1 o'clock, and it's obvious this conversation could continue, as Julie said, for 3 hours. There are a few more questions. We got to a number of them. So thank you so much to all the participants for being here, for participating, for your attention and your questions and engagement. Thank you so much to our panelists. What a really incredible set of remarks, and really great learning for all of us here today about the work you're doing on food justice and what's happening in Minnesota. So thank you very much. Thank you also to the Global Programs and Strategy Alliance for sponsoring this work and this webinar series. And thank you to the wonderful staff team who helped put this together today. So thanks everyone. And again, this webinar will be available online, and the registration materials you have received by email have some information on that. So thanks again, and have a wonderful day. Thanks for all your contributions.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.